You can be a woman of faith by following the example of Sarah. Sarah believed God's promise. She's an example for us of a person who believes God's promise. And so we want to see women in our families, in our churches, in our neighborhoods, and in our communities who know and believe God's promise. Hear what Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11 has to say about this very matter. In Hebrews chapter 11, the great faith chapter, this is what God records about Sarah's faith. It says, by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. She believed God's promise, but bigger than that, she considered him faithful who had made that promise. She considered that the God who had spoken a word of promise would be faithful in keeping his word. And so when we go back to the book of Genesis, we can trace out the story. In Genesis chapter 15, in the opening verses of that chapter, the Lord comes to Abram, and Abram is childless. And he's saying to the Lord, what are you going to give me? And he said, my heir is Eliezer of Damascus. He's who's going to get all of my inheritance when I die because I don't have a child. And God says this word of promise, 15 verse 4, Genesis 15 verse 4, this man will not be your heir, but his son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. Look at the sky, count the stars. Indeed, if you can count them, and he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And the record of Scripture in Genesis 15 verse 6 is that Abraham believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now in Genesis chapter 16, we find that Abram shared God's promise with Sarah, and her initial response was not belief. Her initial response was, I'm beyond the years of childbirth. Take my servant Hagar, have a child with Hagar, and she will serve as a surrogate and have a son on my behalf that will be your heir. And then God comes back in Genesis chapter 17 at verse 19 and says, no, it's not going to be Ishmael. It's not going to be the son of Hagar. No, it is Sarah. It is Sarah, your wife. I'm going to bless her, and I am going to give her a son. And I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Abram, it's going to be your son by Sarah that's your heir, the heir to the promise. And so when Sarah hears this news, she laughs. Genesis 18, verse 11 through 14. She laughs. Her initial response, again, was not one of faith. She laughed. And God said, why is Sarah laughing? And God then gave this word, nothing is impossible by the Lord. And in a year's time, a year from now, Sarah will conceive and give birth to a son. And that's what is recorded in Genesis chapter 21 at verse 2, the fulfillment of God's promise. Because then Sarah believed. She took God at his word. And the record of Scripture is Genesis 21, verse 1. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. And she gave birth to a son, and she named him Isaac, as God had instructed. Sarah is an example of a woman who is an ordinary woman. She's an everyday woman. She's like us. And sometimes we don't initially believe God and his promise. Sometimes we try to help God out and solve God's problem for him in helping him answer his promise for us on our terms. Sometimes we laugh in unbelief at God's promises. But God would have us come to the place like Sarah did, where she would understand that nothing is too hard for the Lord. And that we would take his word and consider him faithful to fulfill his promise towards us.